In order for an ethical theory to exist, it needs to be universal and consistent. It can only exist if we accept the fact of self-ownership. If there are those who own others and those who are owned by others, then no ethical theory can exist because it cannot be universalized and it cannot be consistent amongst those two types of individuals. Every individual being owned simultaneously by everyone else is a universal and consistent position. However, it is impossible. If we do not directly affect that which we claim to own, then we do not own it. Individuals have different ideas and different desires. Unless everyone alive agrees about what everyone else must be doing all the time, then it is impossible for everyone to be owned by everybody else. A situation where each individual owns his or herself not only can be universalized and is consistent, but it can also exist in reality. To go forward, I will propose these two definitions here. Negative rights are those rights that require negative action. Negative rights are the rights that oblige others not to act in a way that would directly attempt against someone else's self-ownership. Positive rights are the rights that oblige others to engage in a positive action. Self-ownership implies that I am responsible for the direct results of my actions, and I am also the beneficiary of the direct result of those actions. Like if I move my leg in a way that I end up kicking somebody, then I am responsible for kicking somebody. In the same way, if I use my head to come up with an idea, and I use my body to put it into practice, then I own the benefits from those actions. Now, if we are able to come up with a universal rule of ethics, then principles must be applied to everyone who is in full capacity of the reason and to all situations involving human interaction. Since ethics is only involved in situations where individuals interact, it is unnecessary and impossible to apply ethics to an action that involves only the actor and that directly impacts only the actor. If I own myself, then I am free to do with myself whatever I please to do as long as it does not directly harm anybody else. So if we universalize self-ownership, then every individual owns his or herself. This is why directly affecting someone else with our actions is subject to ethical analysis, precisely because those who we affected also own themselves. For example, I am perfectly free to lift my leg whenever I please to do so. There is no ethical analysis to be made about that decision. But if I happen to hit somebody as a result, then my action may or may not be unethical according to the context. No action is inherently ethical or unethical without a context. Okay, so if everyone owns his or herself, then forcing somebody to engage in an action would constitute a violation of that individual's self-ownership. In other words, a violation of that individual's property. Now we have introduced the concept of property, but it was already implicit in what we've been talking about. There is no ownership without property. Self-ownership then means that my body is my property. If I own myself and are responsible for my actions, then I am also the beneficiary of my actions and the owner of those results. I own my labor, so I own the result of my labor. That result may be money or products which I now own. My body is my property, and the yield of my labor is my property. If we are to talk about universal theory of ethics, and if we accept the fact that self-ownership exists, then we must accept the fact that every individual's own body is that individual's property, and therefore each individual has the right to decide upon his or her own body. This fact has two implications. Number one, universal positive rights are ethically impossible, since it would oblige someone to engage in positive action regardless of that individual's consent, which would negate self-ownership. Number two, universal negative rights are necessary in ethics, since an individual owning his or herself excludes everyone else from making unilateral decisions about that individual. So a universal right to education implies that someone else has to educate me, which constitutes a positive right, and thus a violation of self-ownership. On the other hand, a universal right not to be killed implies that no one other than me can make the decision to purposefully end my life. My right not to be killed does not imply positive action, so it is a negative right and does not violate self-ownership. I want to make a quick distinction here, because I've read and heard many times before people claiming that the right to live is a negative right. I think they usually mean the right not to be killed. The right not to be killed is a negative right. However, the right to live is a positive right, because it requires that if necessary, others must provide the necessary situation for me to live. It may look like a very subtle difference, but it makes all the difference in the world. I am responsible for my own decisions, even if those lead to my death, and no one is ethically required to keep me from dying as a result of my own actions. However, everyone else is required to respect my life by not purposefully ending it without my consent. So we have established that it is ethically impossible to enforce universal positive rights. The right to education, the right to have a home, the right to any service, they all imply that someone else is responsible to provide me with those things. We also established that if we accept self-ownership, in order to have a universal theory of ethics, universal negative rights must be enforced. The right not to be killed, the right to be left alone and not bothered, property rights, they all imply that I decide for myself, but they do not imply that someone else must provide me with anything. Does this mean that positive rights are always to be considered unethical, and that negative rights are always to be ethically applied? No. If that were the case, then the whole theory would be a contradiction. How would I own myself if I can't decide to be killed by someone? For example, a case of euthanasia. If I can't renounce to any negative right in my interaction with a specific person, in this case maybe a doctor, then I don't really own myself. Also, how can I own myself if I cannot trade with a willing trade partner? Trade implies both the surrender of a specific negative right to a specific trade partner in exchange for a specific positive right over that same person. For example, I waive my right not to have a banana taken from me by Adam, in exchange for being able to take $1 from Adam as a result of a bilateral agreement with him. In simpler words, I sell a banana to Adam for $1. I own a banana which I now must give to Adam. That is a positive action needed from me in order for the interaction to be ethical. And Adam has $1 that he now must give to me. This all means that negative rights are not only universal, but they are ours to willfully waive in someone else's favor, in turn become that person's positive right in relation to us. This is the only way to uphold self-ownership while having a universal theory of ethics. There are 3 ways in which an interaction is considered unethical. These are the 3 principles that must be applied to all human interaction to analyze from an ethical perspective. Number 1. A situation where X infringes upon a negative right of Y, or threats to infringe upon that right, which Y has not willfully waived in X's favor, is unethical. For example, Peter takes $100 from Mary's purse without previous agreement. Peter has acted unethically, and thus Mary has acquired a positive right over Peter. Now Peter has an obligation to give Mary $100 plus any cost that Mary had from the original unethical transaction. Number 2. A situation where X fails to comply with a positive right which Y acquired from X in a mutual agreement. In this case, X is acting unethically and Y acquires a positive right in relation to X to recover from X the value lost in the interaction. For example, Peter agrees to sell his car to Mary for $10,000. Mary has given Peter the $10,000, and Peter fails to give his car to Mary. Peter has acted unethically, and thus Mary acquires a positive right over Peter. Peter has now the obligation to give his car to Mary, plus any cost in which Mary incurred as a result of Peter's unethical action. Or, Mary has acquired a positive right in relation to Peter. Peter now has the obligation to give Mary the original $10,000, plus the cost in which Mary incurred as a result of Peter's unethical action, plus the difference between the $10,000 and the value that Mary assigns to the car. Now we enter a more difficult situation of assessing the value that Mary assigns to the car. This is probably the subject of another video about the dispute resolution organizations, or DROs, and how they would be an option for situations such as this. Number 3. A situation where X's actions create a situation that directly affects Y, and X refuses to be responsible for his or her action is unethical. This would apply to more complex situations like abortion. If a woman has consensual sex and becomes pregnant as a result, then if you consider the embryo to be a live human being, then the woman would be in no ethical position to have an abortion because she created a situation in which the embryo now inhabits her body. On the other hand, if a woman is raped and becomes pregnant as a result, then she would not be acting unethically if she had an abortion, because the embryo would now be inhabiting her body and consuming her resources without her creating the situation willfully. This, of course, is open to interpretation until it is, or if it ever is, established scientifically when life begins. I am not making a statement about that, since it would only be a hollow opinion. I do have an opinion about it, but that's all it is, just an opinion. All human interactions can be ethically analyzed using those 3 parameters. If a situation arose in which one of those 3 parameters happens, then the situation is unethical. This may lead us to some uncomfortable truths. However, logic is not there to satisfy our perceptions or preconceptions or prejudices. Extortion is unethical if all options given represent a violation of negative rights. For example, if I threaten you with violence to get money from you, I may have not violated your negative rights yet, but I have only given you 2 options which both mean the violation of your negative rights. Thus, I have acted unethically. On the other hand, if not all options involve the violation of a negative right, then it is not unethical. For example, if I threaten you with publicizing information that you want to keep private, if you don't give me money, I have given you an option that does not require a violation of your negative rights. Me publicizing information that you want to keep private does not constitute a violation of your negative rights unless I obtain that information unethically or I obtain that information ethically with the agreement that I would not publicize it. In this sense, blackmail does not necessarily constitute an unethical action.